Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates painted their nails and talked about boyfriends, she spent her weekends learning first aid from her grandfather, a Vietnam War veteran who had served as a combat medic. He would tell her stories about saving lives under fire, about the weight of carrying both medical supplies and weapons, about making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Her grandfather, Roberto Martinez, had been decorated for valor during his service in the jungles of Southeast Asia. He carried shrapnel in his left leg that made him walk with a slight limp, a constant reminder of the day he had dragged 3 wounded soldiers to safety while enemy fire rained down around them. Sarah would sit on his porch for hours, listening to his stories, absorbing every detail about battlefield medicine and tactical awareness. When Sarah turned 18, she made a decision that shocked her family. Instead of accepting a scholarship to nursing school, she enlisted in the Navy with one goal in mind: becoming a hospital corpsman assigned to the Marine Corps. Her parents were devastated. Her mother cried for weeks, unable to understand why her daughter would choose such a dangerous path when she had so many other opportunities. Basic training was brutal. Sarah was one of only 12 women in a company of 200 recruits. The physical demands were crushing, but the mental challenges were even harder. She had to prove herself every single day, not just to her instructors but to her fellow recruits who questioned whether a woman could handle the pressures of combat medicine. During one particularly grueling exercise, Sarah's unit was simulating a mass casualty event. Fake blood covered the training area, and actors pretended to be wounded soldiers screaming for help. While other recruits froze or became overwhelmed, Sarah moved with purpose and precision. She triaged the wounded, applied tourniquets, started 4 lines, and coordinated evacuations. Her instructor, Chief Petty Officer Williams, watched in silence as she worked. After the exercise, Chief Williams pulled Sarah aside. He was a mountain of a man with 22 years of service and 3 combat deployments. His face was weathered like old leather, and his eyes had seen too much death and destruction. He looked at Sarah for a long moment before speaking. "Martinez, I've been training corpsmen for 15 years, he said in his gravelly voice. I've seen tough guys break down crying when they see their first real casualty. I've seen heroes freeze up when the bullets start flying. But you have something different. You have ice water in your veins and fire in your belly. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong here." Those words carried Sarah through the rest of her training. She graduated at the top of her class in Field Medical Service School, where Navy corpsmen learned to work with Marines in combat situations. She excelled in everything from battlefield surgery to tactical movement. Her instructors noted her exceptional ability to remain calm under pressure and her natural leadership qualities. Sarah's first deployment was to Afghanistan's Helmand province, one of the most dangerous areas in the country. She was assigned to a Marine rifle company that was tasked with clearing Taliban strongholds in rural villages. The Marines initially treated her with skepticism. They had never worked with a female corpsman before, and many questioned whether she could carry her weight in combat. The company's commanding officer, Captain Jake Morrison, was a tough career Marine from Alabama who had already completed 2 combat tours. He had lost 3 corpsmen in his previous deployment, and he was protective of his Marines. During their first briefing, he made it clear that Sarah would have to prove herself just like everyone else. "Doc," he said, using the traditional nickname for Navy corpsmen, "my Marines are going to depend on you to keep them alive. I don't care if you're male or female, black or white, or from Mars. All I care about is whether you can do your job when the shooting starts. These boys are my responsibility, and I won't let them down." Sarah's first real test came during a routine patrol in a village called Marja. Intelligence reports suggested the area was clear of Taliban forces, but as Sarah's unit moved through the narrow streets, they walked into a carefully planned ambush. Machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions, and rocket-propelled grenades exploded around them. Lance Corporal Tommy Rodriguez, a 19-year-old kid from Los Angeles, took a bullet through his thigh that severed his femoral artery. Blood was pumping out of his leg with each heartbeat, and he was screaming for his mother in Spanish and English. The Marines around him were pinned down by enemy fire and couldn't reach him. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her medical bag and low-crawled through the dirt and debris toward Rodriguez's position, bullets snapping over her head and kicking up dust around her. When she reached him, his face was already pale from blood loss, and his eyes were starting to roll back. Working purely on training and instinct, Sarah applied direct pressure to the wound while simultaneously preparing a tourniquet. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and she could hear the Marines shouting coordinates and calling for air support. Rodriguez grabbed her arm with surprising strength for someone who was bleeding out. "Doc, am I going to die?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos around them. Sarah looked directly into his eyes as she tightened the tourniquet around his upper thigh. "Not today, Marine. Not on my watch." She quickly established an intravenous line and began pushing fluids to combat his shock. While she worked, she coordinated with the evacuation team over her radio, providing detailed information about Rodriguez's condition and the medical care he would need during transport. The helicopter evacuation was performed under fire, with Marine aircraft providing close air support to suppress the Taliban positions. Sarah stayed with Rodriguez throughout the entire process, monitoring his vital signs and adjusting his treatment as needed. When the helicopter lifted off, she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Captain Morrison found her sitting alone behind a concrete barrier, staring at her blood-covered hands. He sat down next to her without saying anything for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than she had ever heard it before. "Doc, that was some of the finest combat medicine I've ever seen," he said quietly. "Rodriguez is alive because you didn't hesitate to put yourself in danger to save him. That's what being a corpsman is all about." Sarah's reputation spread throughout the battalion. The Marines who had initially doubted her capabilities now spoke of her with reverence and respect. They had seen her risk her own life to save one of their own, and that earned her a place in their brotherhood that could never be taken away. But Sarah knew that Rodriguez was just the first. Over the next several months, she would be tested again and again in the brutal crucible of combat. She would learn that being a corpsman meant carrying the weight of every decision, living with the knowledge that someone's life depended on her skills and her courage. Late at night, when the fighting was quiet and the base was still, Sarah would write letters to her grandfather. She told him about the Marines she served with, about the wounded she had treated, about the constant fear and the moments of incredible bravery she witnessed every day. She never mentioned her own actions, but her grandfather could read between the lines. In one of his letters back to her, he wrote something that would stay with her for the rest of her deployment: "Mija, being a corpsman is not about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing your job anyway. It's about putting other people's lives before your own, even when every instinct tells you to run. You carry the hopes and dreams of every Marine in your unit, and that's a responsibility that will change you forever." Sarah's transformation from small-town girl to combat-tested corpsman was nearly complete, but she had no idea that her greatest challenge was still ahead of her. The mission that would define her career and earn her a place in military legend was approaching, and it would require her to make a choice that no medical professional should ever have to make. The Taliban was planning something big, and intelligence reports suggested that Sarah's unit was walking into the fight of their lives. She would soon discover that sometimes saving lives requires taking them, and that the line between medic and warrior is thinner than most people realize. The mission briefing took place in a dusty tent that served as the battalion's operations center. Sarah sat among 30 Marines, studying satellite photos of their target, a remote valley system called Wadi Tangi, where Taliban forces had been massing for weeks. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target, a bomb maker responsible for dozens of American casualties, was hiding in a fortified compound deep in the valley. Colonel Rebecca Hayes, the task force commander, stood before a large map covered in red markings that indicated known enemy positions. She was a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, one of the first women to command a combat unit in special operations. Her presence commanded immediate respect from everyone in the room. "This is going to be different from anything you've faced before," Colonel Hayes explained, her voice cutting through the tension in the tent. "We're dealing with a sophisticated enemy who has had weeks to prepare defensive positions. They know we're coming, and they're ready for a fight." The plan was complex and dangerous. Sarah's Marine unit would insert by helicopter at dawn, establish a base of operations, then advance on foot through 3 miles of hostile territory to reach the target compound. Special forces units would simultaneously attack from the north, creating a pincer movement designed to trap the enemy forces. Captain Morrison briefed his Marines on their specific role in the operation. Sarah would accompany 2nd Squad, led by Staff Sergeant Mike Chen, a career Marine from San Francisco who had earned the Silver Star during his previous deployment. Chen was known for his tactical brilliance and his fierce loyalty to his Marines. Doc Martinez has proven herself over the past 6 months, Captain Morrison announced to the assembled Marines. She saved lives under fire, and she's earned the right to be here. I want everyone to remember that when things get heavy out there. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had treated dozens of wounded Marines during her deployment, but this mission felt different. The intelligence reports painted a picture of a well-organized enemy force with extensive fortifications and heavy weapons. The casualty estimates were sobering. The night before the operation, Sarah performed her ritual equipment check. She laid out her medical supplies on her bunk: trauma bandages, tourniquets, morphine syringes, for bags, chest seals, and 100 other items that could mean the difference between life and death. Her medical bag weighed 42 pounds, and she carried an additional 30 pounds of personal gear and ammunition. Her rifle, an M4 carbine, lay beside her medical equipment. She had qualified expert with the weapon during training, but she had never fired it in combat. The Marines had teased her about being too pretty to shoot anyone, not knowing that she spent her off-duty hours practicing marksmanship with Staff Sergeant Chen, who had quickly recognized her natural ability with firearms. Lance Corporal Rodriguez approached her bunk, walking with only a slight limp from his wound months earlier. His recovery had been complete, and he had insisted on returning to duty despite having the option to go home. He carried a small wooden cross that his grandmother had given him before deployment. "Doc, I wanted to give you this," he said, holding out the cross. "My grandmother said it would protect whoever carries it. You saved my life, so now it's yours." Sarah accepted the cross, feeling its smooth surface worn down by countless fingers. "Tommy, I can't take this. It belongs with your family." "My family includes you now, Doc," Rodriguez replied with a grin. "Besides, I figure you're going to need all the help you can get tomorrow." The helicopter insertion began at 0530 hours, just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. Sarah's stomach churned from a combination of motion sickness and adrenaline as their CH-47 Chinook flew nap of the earth through the valleys, avoiding enemy radar and anti-aircraft weapons. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom: 2 minutes to landing zone. Intelligence reports possible enemy activity in the area. Sarah checked her equipment one final time and made eye contact with each Marine in her squad. These were her boys, her responsibility. Private First Class Jackson, barely 18 years old, who sent half his pay home to support his mother. Corporal Williams, a tough kid from Detroit who had joined the Marines to escape a life of poverty and violence. Lance Corporal Park, a Korean American from Seattle who was studying to become a teacher after his enlistment ended. The helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash. Sarah followed the Marines out of the aircraft, immediately seeking cover behind a low stone wall as the helicopter lifted off and disappeared over the ridgeline. The silence that followed was deafening after hours of engine noise. Staff Sergeant Chun quickly organized his squad for movement. They would advance through a series of terraced fields toward the mountains, using whatever cover they could find. Intelligence had identified several possible enemy observation posts along their route, and everyone knew that they were walking into a potential ambush. The first 3 hours of movement were uneventful. Sarah's squad covered nearly 2 miles of ground, communicating through hand signals and moving in tactical formation. The Afghan countryside was beautiful in the early morning light, with snow-capped peaks rising in the distance and ancient irrigation channels cutting through fertile fields. Everything changed when they reached a narrow pass between 2 rocky hills. Staff Sergeant Chen held up his fist, the signal for everyone to freeze. Through her rifle scope, Sarah could see movement among the rocks above them. The Taliban had been waiting. The ambush began with a rocket-propelled grenade that exploded 20 meters to their left, showering the Marines with rocks and debris. Machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions, and Sarah's world dissolved into chaos and violence. Contact left. Contact right. Staff Sergeant Chen shouted into his radio. We're taking heavy fire from elevated positions. Private First Class Jackson took the first hit, a rifle bullet that shattered his right shoulder and spun him around like a rag doll. He fell behind a boulder, screaming for help and clutching his shattered arm. Sarah didn't think, she simply reacted, grabbing her medical bag and sprinting toward his position while bullets snapped through the air around her. The wound was severe. The bullet had destroyed Jackson's shoulder joint and severed several major blood vessels. Sarah quickly applied a pressure dressing and established in 4-line while Jackson writhed in pain. She administered morphine for the pain and called for helicopter evacuation over her radio. This is Doc Martinez. I have one urgent surgical, shoulder wound with vascular damage. Need immediate dust-off. The response came back immediately, negative on dust-off. Landing zone is too hot. You need to move the casualty to alternate LZ, coordinates to follow. Sarah looked at the map coordinates. The alternate landing zone was 800 meters away, across open ground that was being swept by machine gun fire. Moving Jackson would be incredibly dangerous, but leaving him where he was meant certain death. Staff Sergeant Chen crawled over to her position, his face grim. Doc, we're pinned down hard. I count at least 15 enemy fighters in prepared positions. We need air support, but the closest aircraft is 20 minutes out. As if to emphasize his point, another RPG exploded nearby, this one close enough to cover them with dirt and rocks. Sarah could hear Jackson's breathing becoming more labored as shock began to set in. His blood pressure was dropping, and his pulse was becoming weak and rapid. Sergeant, I need to get Jackson to that LZ now, Sarah said, checking her medical supplies. He's not going to last 20 minutes. Doc, it's suicide to move across that open ground, Chen replied. The machine gun has a clear field of fire across the entire area. Sarah looked at Jackson's pale face and made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She began preparing a litter to carry the wounded Marine, knowing that she was probably sentencing herself to death in the process. Corporal Williams volunteered to help carry Jackson, despite the obvious danger. Doc, if you're going, I'm going with you, he said simply. Nobody gets left behind. They waited for a lull in the enemy fire, then began their desperate dash across the exposed ground. Sarah carried the front of the litter while Williams took the rear, both of them running as fast as they could while machine gun bullets kicked up dirt around their feet. They were halfway to the landing zone when Williams stumbled and fell. Sarah turned to see blood spreading across the back of his uniform. He had been hit in the spine and was unable to move his legs. Now she had 2 wounded Marines and no way to carry both of them to safety. The sound of the approaching helicopter grew louder, but Sarah knew that the Taliban would concentrate their fire on the aircraft as soon as it appeared. She had seconds to make an impossible choice: save Jackson, who might survive with immediate medical care, or stay with Williams, who was probably going to die regardless of what she did. The decision was made for her when a Taliban fighter appeared from behind a nearby wall, raising his AK-47 toward the approaching helicopter. Without thinking, Sarah dropped her medical bag, raised her rifle, and fired 3 quick shots center mass. The enemy fighter crumpled to the ground. That moment changed everything. Sarah Martinez was no longer just a medic trying to save lives. She was a warrior fighting to protect her Marines, and the rules of engagement had just become very different. The helicopter was landing, but more enemy fighters were emerging from their hiding places, and Sarah realized that sometimes the only way to save lives is to take them. The helicopter roared overhead as Sarah stood over the body of the Taliban fighter she had just killed. Her hands shook slightly as she lowered her rifle, but there was no time to process what had happened. More enemy fighters were moving toward their position, and Williams was bleeding heavily from his spinal wound. The CH-47 Chinook touched down in a cloud of dust 50 meters away. The crew chief was already running toward them, carrying a stretcher and medical supplies. Sarah could see the door gunners laying down suppressing fire as more Taliban fighters appeared from concealed positions around the landing zone. Doc, we got more company. Corporal Williams shouted, pointing toward a group of enemy fighters approaching from the east. Despite his injuries, he was still trying to provide cover fire with his M4 rifle. Sarah made a split-second decision that went against every principle of medical ethics she had ever learned. Instead of focusing solely on treating the wounded, she positioned herself between her patients and the enemy fighters, using her rifle to engage targets while simultaneously coordinating the medical evacuation. The scene was surreal. Sarah would fire several rounds at advancing Taliban fighters, then drop down to check Jackson's pulse and adjust his 4-drip, then return to her rifle to engage more targets. She was functioning as both medic and machine gunner, switching between roles with a fluidity that seemed impossible. The crew chief reached their position just as another wave of enemy fighters emerged from a dry creek bed. "Doc, we need to move now," he yelled over the sound of gunfire. "Intelligence reports a larger force moving toward this position." Loading the wounded Marines into the helicopter required exposing themselves to enemy fire. Sarah and the crew chief lifted Jackson first, his unconscious form heavy and awkward as they struggled to get him aboard. Williams was conscious but unable to move his lower body, and loading him required 3 people working together while bullets snapped overhead. As they worked, Sarah noticed movement in her peripheral vision. A Taliban fighter had positioned himself behind a low wall about 30 meters away and was preparing to fire a rocket-propelled grenade at the helicopter. The aircraft was vulnerable while loading casualties, and a direct hit would kill everyone aboard. Sarah didn't hesitate. She dropped Williams's legs, grabbed her rifle, and put 2 rounds center mass into the RPG gunner before he could fire. The enemy fighter collapsed, but his weapon clattered onto the rocks nearby. Sarah realized that more fighters might try to recover the RPG and use it against them. "I need to secure that position," she shouted to the crew chief. "Keep loading, Williams." Against all protocols and common sense, Sarah left her wounded Marines and sprinted toward the enemy position. She had crossed the line from medic to combat soldier, and there was no going back. Her training had taught her to save lives, but now she was taking them to accomplish that mission. She reached the Taliban fighter's position and quickly confirmed he was dead. The RPG launcher was damaged but still functional, and she could see several rockets scattered nearby. Sarah made another decision that would have shocked her instructors back in medical school. She destroyed the weapon with a thermite grenade, denying its use to other enemy fighters. The helicopter crew was becoming increasingly anxious as enemy fire intensified. "Doc, we need to go now," the pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "I've got fuel for maybe 2 more minutes on the ground." Sarah sprinted back to the aircraft, where Williams was finally being loaded aboard. As she climbed into the cabin, she could see Staff Sergeant Chen's squad advancing toward their position, providing covering fire and preparing to extract with them. But the Taliban had other plans. A second group of fighters had positioned themselves along the helicopter's departure route, armed with heavy machine guns and more RPGs. The pilot would have to fly directly over their positions to reach safety, and the aircraft was already overloaded with casualties and medical personnel. "We're not going to make it with all this weight," the pilot announced grimly. "Someone needs to stay behind." Sarah looked at her wounded Marines, both of whom required immediate surgical care to survive. Then, she looked at the crew chief, who was essential for operating the aircraft's defensive systems. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple: someone had to stay behind to fight a rearguard action, and Sarah was the logical choice. "I'm staying," she announced, grabbing extra ammunition and medical supplies. "Get these boys to a surgeon." Staff Sergeant Chen's voice crackled over her radio. "Negative, Doc. We're not leaving anyone behind." "This isn't a request, Sergeant," Sarah replied firmly. "Jackson needs surgery within the hour, and Williams has a spinal cord injury that requires immediate stabilization. I'm trained for this mission. Get them out of here." The helicopter lifted off with Sarah standing alone on the landing zone, watching her patients disappear into the distance. She had violated every rule of combat medicine by abandoning her casualties, but she had also saved their lives by ensuring they reached definitive medical care. Now she faced a different challenge. Chen's squad was still 800 meters away, fighting their way through heavily defended terrain. Sarah was alone with limited ammunition, surrounded by enemy fighters who were undoubtedly converging on her position. She found cover behind a concrete irrigation structure and began assessing her situation. She had 6 full magazines for her M4 rifle, plus her sidearm and for fragmentation grenades. Her medical supplies were limited but included morphine, which could be useful if she was wounded and needed to continue fighting. The first Taliban fighters appeared within minutes, moving cautiously through the rocks and scrub vegetation around the landing zone. Sarah could count at least 8 individuals, all armed with automatic weapons and moving with the tactical discipline of experienced fighters. What happened next would become the stuff of legend among Marine Corps medical personnel. Sarah Martinez, a Navy hospital corpsman who had enlisted to save lives, began systematically hunting and killing enemy fighters with a precision and ruthlessness that shocked even veteran combat soldiers. She used her medical knowledge to her advantage, targeting enemy fighters in ways that would incapacitate them quickly and quietly. She understood human anatomy better than most infantry soldiers, and she applied that knowledge with lethal efficiency. Her first target was a Taliban spotter who was trying to coordinate the movement of other fighters. Sarah put a single round through his upper chest, disrupting his heart and lungs with surgical precision. He dropped silently, and it took several minutes before other fighters realized he was down. Sarah moved after each shot, using the terrain and her knowledge of Taliban tactics to stay ahead of their search efforts. She had studied enemy techniques during her deployment, and she understood how they communicated and moved in small unit operations. Her second target was a machine gunner who was setting up a defensive position to cover the other fighters. Sarah waited until he was focused on his weapon, then fired a carefully aimed shot that penetrated the base of his skull. Again, the kill was silent and devastating. Staff Sergeant Chen's squad was making progress toward her position, but they were still encountering heavy resistance. Sarah could hear the firefight raging across the valley, with the distinctive crack of M4 rifles mixing with the heavier sound of AK-47s and machine guns. The remaining Taliban fighters had realized they were being hunted, and they began moving more cautiously. Sarah had to adapt her tactics, using her medical training in unexpected ways. She understood how fear and stress affected human performance, and she used psychological warfare to break down their effectiveness. She began leaving evidence of her presence in ways designed to intimidate and confuse the enemy. She would fire a single shot, then disappear, leaving the fighters wondering where she was and how many Americans were actually fighting them. The psychological pressure was working. Sarah could see the Taliban fighters becoming increasingly paranoid and disorganized. They were shooting at shadows and calling out to each other in voices tight with fear. Her fourth kill came when 2 fighters tried to flank her position. Sarah had anticipated their movement and positioned herself in a location where she could engage both targets quickly. She dropped the first with a headshot, then pivoted and killed the second before he could react to his partner's death. By this point, the remaining Taliban fighters were in full retreat. They had expected to fight a traditional military unit, not a single American who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost, killing with medical precision and vanishing before they could respond. Staff Sergeant Chen's voice came over the radio. "Doc, where are you?" "We're almost to your position." Sarah emerged from her hiding place, her uniform covered in dust and her rifle still smoking from recent use. She had transformed from healer to killer and back again, crossing boundaries that most people couldn't even imagine. When Chen's squad reached her position, they found 8 dead Taliban fighters scattered around the landing zone. Sarah was calmly cleaning her rifle, but her hands were still shaking from adrenaline and the psychological impact of what she had done. "Doc," Chen said quietly, "what the hell happened here?" Sarah looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much. "I did my job, Sergeant. I protected my patients and kept the LZ clear for extraction." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew that something fundamental had changed inside her. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the weight of that transformation was just beginning to settle on her shoulders. The real challenge wasn't killing enemy fighters, it was living with what she had become. Word of Sarah's actions at Wadi Tangi spread through the military like wildfire. Within hours, Every unit in Afghanistan had heard the story of the Navy corpsman who had single-handedly eliminated 8 enemy fighters while protecting a medical evacuation. The tale grew with each telling, until Sarah Martinez became something between a folk hero and a legend. Colonel Hayes personally flew to Sarah's forward operating base to debrief her on the mission. They met in the base commander's office, a sparse room with concrete walls and a single window overlooking the airfield. Sarah sat across from the colonel, still wearing her combat uniform with its telltale bloodstains and bullet holes. "Corpsman Martinez," Colonel Hayes began, her voice carrying the weight of command authority, "what you accomplished yesterday was extraordinary by any measure. 8 confirmed enemy kills while protecting wounded Marines and maintaining a landing zone under fire. I've never seen anything like it in 20 years of military service." Sarah stared at her hands, which still trembled slightly despite her efforts to control them. "Ma'am, I just did what needed to be done. Those Marines were my responsibility." "What you did went far beyond normal corpsman duties," the colonel continued. "You made tactical decisions that saved lives and neutralized a significant enemy threat. Command wants to put you in for the Silver Star." The Silver Star. It was one of the highest decorations for valor that could be awarded to enlisted personnel. Sarah should have felt honored, but instead she felt hollow and confused. She had killed 8 human beings in the span of 30 minutes, using skills that were supposed to be used for healing. "Ma'am, I appreciate the recognition, but I'm not sure I deserve it," Sarah said quietly. "I abandoned my wounded Marines to fight the enemy. That goes against everything I was taught as a corpsman." Colonel Hayes leaned forward, her expression serious. "Martinez, you didn't abandon anyone. You made a tactical decision that ensured your casualties received the medical care they needed to survive. Both Jackson and Williams are alive today because of your actions." The debriefing continued for 2 hours, with intelligence officers asking detailed questions about Taliban tactics and weapon placements. Sarah answered mechanically, but her mind kept returning to the faces of the men she had killed. They had been young, probably not much older than the Marines she served with. After the meeting, Sarah walked alone across the base, trying to process what had happened to her. She had always seen herself as a healer, someone who brought people back from the edge of death. Now she was also a killer, someone who had taken lives with the same precision she used to save them. She found herself at the base chapel, a small building constructed from shipping containers and concrete barriers. The chaplain, Lieutenant Commander Roberts, was a kind man in his 50s who had counseled hundreds of service members struggling with the moral complexities of warfare. "I heard about yesterday," he said gently as Sarah sat down in one of the folding chairs that served as pews. "How are you holding up?" Sarah struggled to find the words. "Chaplain, I became a corpsman to save lives. Yesterday I killed 8 people. I don't know who I am anymore." "You're still the same person who has saved dozens of Marines over the past 7 months," Roberts replied. "What you did yesterday doesn't change that. It adds to it." "But I liked it," Sarah whispered, voicing the thought that had been haunting her since the firefight. "When I was hunting those fighters, when I was killing them, there was a part of me that enjoyed the challenge." "What kind of person does that make me?" The chaplain was quiet for a long moment before responding. "It makes you human, Sarah. Combat changes people. It brings out parts of ourselves that we didn't know existed. The question isn't whether you enjoyed the fight, the question is what you do with that knowledge going forward." Over the following weeks, Sarah's story continued to spread throughout the military community. She received letters from medics and corpsmen around the world, thanking her for proving that medical personnel could be warriors when the situation demanded it. She also received criticism from some quarters, with medical ethicists questioning whether her actions had violated the Geneva Convention's protections for medical personnel. The controversy reached its peak when a military medical journal published an article analyzing Sarah's actions from an ethical standpoint. The author argued that by engaging in direct combat, Sarah had forfeited the protected status traditionally afforded to medical personnel and had potentially endangered other corpsmen by blurring the lines between combatant and non-combatant. Sarah read the article alone in her quarters, feeling the weight of judgment from people who had never faced the impossible choices of combat. the academic debate seemed meaningless compared to the simple reality that Jackson and Williams were alive because of what she had done. Her next test came 3 weeks later, during another complex operation in the same general area where she had first killed enemy fighters. Intelligence had identified a new Taliban stronghold, and Sarah's unit was tasked with clearing the area and capturing high-value targets. This time, the mission planners specifically requested Sarah's participation, not as a medic but as a hybrid warrior healer who could provide both medical support and combat capabilities. It was an unprecedented role that had no established protocols or training standards. The operation began before dawn, with multiple Marine units advancing through a valley system that intelligence indicated was heavily defended. Sarah moved with Staff Sergeant Chen's squad, but her role was different now. She carried both medical supplies and additional ammunition, prepared to fight or heal as the situation required. The first contact came when Chen's squad encountered a fortified position blocking their advance route. 3 Taliban fighters were manning a heavy machine gun that commanded the entire approach to their objective. Traditional assault tactics would have resulted in heavy casualties, but Sarah had an idea that combined her medical knowledge with combat tactics. She knew that most fighters relied on adrenaline to maintain their effectiveness in combat, and she understood how to disrupt that psychological state. Using smoke grenades to obscure their position, she maneuvered close enough to engage the enemy fighters with precisely placed shots designed to wound rather than kill immediately. Her first target took a round through the shoulder that shattered his collarbone and disabled his fighting arm. The second fighter was hit in the leg, severing his femoral artery and causing rapid blood loss. Both men were incapacitated but alive, creating a psychological crisis for the third fighter who had to choose between continuing to fight or trying to save his wounded comrades. The psychological warfare worked perfectly. The remaining fighter abandoned his position to help his wounded friends, allowing Chen's squad to advance and secure the machine gun position without sustaining casualties. "Doc, that was brilliant," Chen said as they moved past the neutralized enemy position. "You turned your medical training into a tactical advantage." But Sarah felt no satisfaction from the praise. She had used her knowledge of human anatomy and psychology to create suffering rather than alleviate it. The wounded Taliban fighters would probably survive, but they would carry permanent disabilities that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The mission continued for another 6 hours, with Sarah's unit clearing several more enemy positions and capturing 2 high-value targets. Throughout the operation, Sarah found herself adapting her role based on the tactical situation, sometimes providing medical care and sometimes engaging enemy fighters. By the end of the mission, she had treated 4 wounded Marines and killed 3 more Taliban fighters. She was becoming something new in military medicine, a warrior healer who could switch between roles as the situation demanded. The recognition came quickly. Sarah was awarded the Silver Star for her actions at Wadi Tangi, and she became the first woman to receive the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for combat action while serving as a hospital corpsman. The ceremonies were conducted with full military honors, but Sarah felt disconnected from the celebration. More importantly, her actions had started a revolution in military medical training. The Pentagon began developing new protocols for corpsmen and medics who might be required to engage in direct combat while maintaining their medical responsibilities. Sarah became the template for a new generation of warrior healers. Special Operations Command requested her transfer to work with SEAL teams, where her unique combination of medical skills and combat effectiveness would be put to even greater use. The SEALs had heard about the corpsmen who could kill enemy fighters with surgical precision, and they wanted her expertise for their most dangerous missions. Sarah's final deployment with the Marines ended on a quiet note. She stood on the helicopter landing zone where she had first killed enemy fighters, now empty and peaceful in the afternoon sun. Staff Sergeant Chen stood beside her, preparing for his own rotation home. "Doc, you changed everything," he said quietly. "Before you, we thought medics were just supposed to patch us up when we got hurt. Now we know that sometimes the best way to save lives is to take them." Sarah nodded, but her thoughts were complicated. She had proven that medical personnel could be effective warriors, but at what cost? She had saved countless lives through both healing and killing, but she would never again be the idealistic young woman who had enlisted to help people. The transformation was complete, but the real challenge was just beginning. Sarah Martinez had become a legend, but legends are often more burden than blessing. She would carry the weight of her actions for the rest of her life, knowing that she had forever changed the definition of what it meant to be a military medic. As her helicopter lifted off from Afghanistan for the final time, Sarah looked down at the valley where she had first crossed the line from healer to killer. She had saved dozens of lives and taken many others, becoming something that medical school had never prepared her for, a warrior who fought death itself, using whatever weapons were necessary to win that battle. The SEALs were waiting for her, ready to push the boundaries of warrior medicine even further. Sarah Martinez's war was far from over, it was just beginning.